This is Saxophone Talk by Eastman, a show that features many of the prominent saxophonists in the musical scene, with an opportunity to hear their stories, experiences, and challenges that occurred throughout their musical careers. I'm Roger Greenberg, saxophone specialist for Eastman. Today, we're sitting down with the internationally renowned saxophonist, composer, arranger, educator, and Eastman artist, Bob Mintzer, a longtime member of the Grammy Award-winning group, the Yellowjackets. In addition, he has written over 200 big band arrangements, leads his own Grammy Award-winning Bob Mintzer Big Band, is currently the music director of the WDR Big Band in Cologne, Germany, and is a professor of music and chair of jazz studies at the University of Southern California.
At a very early age, music grabbed me. I think my brain was wired in such a way where I was drawn to music, the sound of it, the detail in it. And initially, I think first exposure was through watching television and listening to the radio. And, through the small LP collection my folks had. And there was just something that really drew me into wanting to know more about how music worked and why it sounded the way it did. And along with this, there was a piano in the house where I grew up. And I think around age 5 was when I started spending long stretches of time sitting at the piano, just experimenting, playing chords and notes and chords in the left hand and a little melody in the right hand, and eventually trying to recreate songs I might hear on television or on the radio or on an LP. And it was just something that I was extremely interested in from a very early age.
Were your parents musically inclined?
No, there was no one in my family that was involved with music in any way, shape, or form. As I said, my folks had show tune records, some folk song kind of records, but certainly no jazz. I mean, that came later. And, I guess what was significant about that time period, we're talking, when I became a teenager in the 60s, rock and roll was just starting to emerge, and it was this really interesting confluence of rhythm and blues, and blues with this sort of Anglo pop music sensibility, and I think along with what was happening culturally with the kind of long hair and the major change in thinking by young people. It was just an exciting time, and that also was very kind of alluring and appealing to me, and I really got drawn into that whole rock and roll movement as well.
Did you start on saxophone?
No, I didn't. I actually played piano because there was one in the house by ear. I took a few lessons on piano. I think the next thing I did was take some clarinet lessons in school. But around the same time, we had family friends that all played folk music on guitars. So I would go over to their house and, I was interested in any instrument. I wanted to try to play any instrument I could get my hands on. And I taught myself how to play guitar. So I was playing guitar. And in fact, when you, in 3rd grade in this elementary school I went to, they passed out these index cards to see, what instrument you might want to play in their music program. And I wrote down guitar. Well, of course, guitar is not a band instrument per se. So they crossed that out and wrote clarinet because they evidently had an overabundance of clarinets. So I wound up playing the clarinet in the school band.
When did you start on saxophone?
probably when I was a teenager, like around 13, I want to say, 12, 13, 14, somewhere in there, in junior high, middle school, as they call it now. I think they needed a saxophone player in the jazz band. So I agreed to do that.
Did you have a early practice routine that you got into?
Not really. No, I was fairly undisciplined. But that said, I spent many hours on music. It was something that was enjoyable, interesting, felt good. So I could spend hours at the piano. I practiced the clarinet minimally. I was more interested in piano and guitar, quite honestly. There's something about polyphony was interesting, I think, from an arranging and just putting notes together kind of perspective. I just found that to be a lot more interesting and rewarding. So I spent most of my time back then on those instruments.
What were your first gigs?
Wow, my first gigs. Well, I think, when I started playing saxophone around 12, 13, 14, actually maybe 14, 15, I started to play a little bit in some of the local big bands around Westchester County, north of New York City, where I grew up. I don't think they paid very much, but, and also I was playing guitar in a rock and roll band from around age 15 on. So we had a couple of little gigs. I mean, again, they didn't pay very much, but that's where it all started.
When you decided you were going to be a professional in New York, who did you study with? Your influences.
Yeah. If I were to back up just a little bit, I think a major turning point for me was 1969, when I had the opportunity to go to Interlochen Arts Academy, which is an arts high school out in Michigan. And that would have been my senior year. That was my senior year in high school. And I guess prior to that, I was very interested in music and spending a good deal of time on various components of writing, arranging, playing. But I hadn't really learned about developing, focused practice habits. And when I went out to Interlochen, I was surrounded by, very focused, young, aspiring musicians who were working very hard. And I learned a lot about how one would develop, as an artist, as a musician, and, started to work on my practice habits. And that carried over nicely into going to music conservatory for 4 years. So when I got to music conservatory, I already knew how to practice. So I was putting in the time, and feel like I made some pretty good progress, during senior high school into being in, university.
Was there a specific event or a time in your life, maybe that time, that took your playing and career to the next level?
Well, there were different. I mean, that experience at Interlochen definitely took my playing to the next level, just in terms of being able to rub shoulders and play with musicians on a high level. I mean, Peter Erskine was a student there at the time, Chris Brubeck, Danny Brubeck, Dave Brubeck's kids, all the classical players, or many of them, wound up in major symphony orchestras. So I guess it's worth mentioning, along with the, sort of schooling and classical training, I had this keen interest in jazz that really happened totally outside of school. I actually had a friend who lived across the street when I was in high school and junior high who was an avid jazz fan. He had this big jazz record collection. So I would go over there and listen to jazz records. And it was really very inspiring. And that's where I sort of got my first real exposure. I mean, aside from jazz band in school, which was, minimal in terms of, depth and substance. There was one turning point. I guess when I was in 10th grade, so probably around 15 years old, Jazzmobile sent a group to my high school. And Jazzmobile was an organization around New York City that may still exist, actually, that would send jazz groups into the community, into schools. In fact, they had a wagon. I mean, the Jazzmobile refers to this wagon, like that was a stage, a movable stage, and it would be hauled by a truck into a neighborhood, and it would stop on a street corner, and a jazz quintet or whatever would do a concert. In any event, Jazzmobile sent this wonderful group consisting of Dr. Billy Taylor on piano, Grady Tate on drums, Ron Carter on bass, Harold Land on tenor saxophone, and Blue Mitchell on trumpet to my high school.
An all-star group.
It was the cream of the crop, and I heard that, and it was like, this is great. I want to learn more about this, and I want to play this music someday. So that was a pivotal experience. After I got at Interlochen, I went to Hart College of Music in Hartford, Connecticut, and Jackie McLean had just started there as a professor, and it was just wonderful to hang out with him and listen to him play and hear stories. And I remember he took us up to Storrs, Connecticut, to hear Sonny Rollins play in 1970, and that was a page turner. That was an eye opener. It was like, man, that's incredible, Around that same time, I was going down into New York City to the Village Vanguard, to the Village Gate. I heard Sonny Stitt play Dexter Gordon. I heard Miles Davis play Thelonious Monk with Charlie Rouse. So I heard Sonny Rollins play. So I was able to get fairly close to these great saxophone players. And there's nothing quite like that in terms of just, getting a sense of what this music is supposed to sound like, how it goes, and what actually, physically you need to do. I mean, one of the big revelations being up close, watching Sonny Rollins, Sonny Stitt, Charlie Rouse, was I realized these guys were they were moving some air through the saxophone. Their necks were kind of sticking out, and you see the veins in their neck. And I was thinking, man, you got to move some air to make that nice sound come out of the horn. So that was very educational and revealing. I would then go into the practice room and kind of experiment with that and see how I could get the sound to be big, but, if you blow too hard, of course, it's kind of like somebody screaming at you. I didn't want that exactly, but I found a way to kind of find that place, that sweet spot where you're moving the air with quick enough velocity, but you also have a nice round, beautiful quality to the sound, and hearing that and seeing that in watching the great saxophone players play was really a big education.
Many of the great innovative jazz musicians of the past reached an amazingly high level with little or no formal study.
Mm-hmm.
They often learned their art in the streets. Would you talk about the advantages and disadvantages of this approach compared to today's opportunities to study jazz in a very formal setting at the university level?
Yeah, I don't know. Rather than compare those two scenarios and decide that one is better than the other, I would choose to focus on individuals. If somebody's motivated and does the homework, they will thrive and develop as an artist that has a profound statement to make, regardless of whether they came up in the 60s where guys learned on the bandstand, or whether it's somebody in current times that's going to a major university. And I say that because both arenas involve exchanging ideas. The format, of course, is quite different. But to just dismiss the current educational scene as something that's not authentic doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because I see certain students in university settings that do all the right stuff and are able to develop as very profound artists with a huge statement to make. I think the important thing is that you do your homework in terms of studying the tradition and developing a vocabulary, and that you then establish relationships with your colleagues in terms of developing and establishing playing situations where you can actually play and write music and make decisions as far as how you want to play, how you want to sound, what you are presenting in your music. And I see that happening in university settings all the time. In fact, some really great bands have developed in university jazz programs. Pat Metheny, case in point, down at the University of Miami. There's a couple of bands that have come out of USC recently. One called Knower, Knower, a great drummer named Lewis Cole. His girlfriend, Jennifer Artadi, were both students at USC, and they developed a group, and they came up with a very distinctive sound, and they're doing very well, and I love what they do. So it's hard to really generalize that way. I think you find individuals in each of those settings that thrive, more so than others.
When you think of some of the innovative players like Coleman Hawkins, Lester Young, Charlie Parker,
right,
how were they able to come up with such a sophisticated approach without formal study?
I would venture to say there was formal study involved. It wasn't necessarily in a university setting, but I know that John Coltrane and Charlie Parker definitely studied classical music, and they studied other players, and they were playing all the time. I mean, I think the ingredients are really looking outside yourself for influence and then spending a lot of time practicing playing with others, writing songs that provide the vehicle for your playing, and just putting into practice things you worked on. I mean, John Coltrane was an incessant practicer. He practiced all the time. He checked out the Nicholas Slonimsky book. He checked out all sorts of classical composition. He was looking at other people's methods and in turn developed his own method, So that's, to my way of thinking, that's formal study, and in conjunction with playing in bands. I mean, I guess that's the thing that's not quite the same. Back in the day, 60s, 50s, 60s, even into the 70s, there were a lot of bands that aspiring musicians could play in. And that's critical. So, the modern day version of that is, number one, you got to be way up on your game and have something distinctive to offer so that you have the ability to play with a lot of different people, play in bands, right? Because that's how we grow. That's how we develop and come up with ideas that form our musical personality by getting out there and playing. How
did the opportunity to join the Buddy Rich Band come about?
Let's see. I joined the Buddy Rich Band spring 1975. And it was Buddy had a small group during 1974 and a big band prior to that. And he wanted to put together a new big band. And he was in New York. So he did what a lot of bands did at that time, hired a contractor, a point person who would put a band together for him. And that contractor was a trumpet player in New York who I think initially called 4 or 5 of his close buddies, and then, had to move beyond that circle to, fill all the slots in a, whatever it was, 16-piece big band. And so, he asked around, who were the hot young players in New York, and my name came up. So I was called to do that gig. And I will tell you, at that time, I was playing in the Tito Puente Orchestra. And that was a great situation. The saxophone section was Renee McLean, Jackie McLean's son, and Roger Rosenberg, a very fine baritone sax player who now works with Steely Dan. He's played on all my big band records. And we got paid $25 per gig, and they took tax out. So I think my take-home weekly check.
Tito Puente.
Yeah, Tito Puente. $100 I got a week. I was thrilled, though, because I had an in-town New York steady gig. My rent was $185 a month, so I was squeaking by, eating beans out of a can sometimes. And I got the call to play with Buddy. And how much, I asked what the salary was. It was $300 a week. And I thought, this is great. I'm rich. I wasn't sure about the whole situation. I had heard stories about how difficult Buddy could be to work for, and so on and so forth. But I just thought it sounded like a great opportunity, and certainly an opportunity to play and travel. And this is what we all hope to do, right, as jazz musicians or musicians in general. So I'll never forget this day. The first rehearsal was at Buddy's Club. He opened a new club on 33rd Street, right across from Penn Station. And so everyone got there early and were seated, and the club was sort of down some stairs, and we're all sitting there waiting for Buddy to show up, and we hear what sounds like a tornado coming down the stairs. It was just this frenzy of screaming and banging. I mean, it sounded like the Red Army was, attacking New York. It's just indescribable. And here comes Buddy and this entourage with his valet, and Buddy is raging over what we're not really sure. They come down the stairs, and the valet runs into the dressing room and comes out with a board, and he puts the board on these two chairs, and Buddy karate chops the board in half, like in front of us. And and Roger Rosenberg and I, who had left Tito's band to come over here, we looked at each other and went, maybe we should have stayed on Tito's band. Anyway, Buddy jumps on the drums and, calls. He's just annoyed at who knows what, and, calls the most difficult, challenging tunes in the book as fast as can be possibly played. And everybody's, scuffling to read, especially the saxophones, who have all these eighth note lines and solis and what have you. And that was the first day of rehearsal with Buddy, and I was just like, oh boy, here we go. But something told me I'm going to weather all of this and stick with it, and see where it goes, and just try to learn as much as I can and play as much as I can.
Did he mellow after that?
I wouldn't go as far as to say he mellowed after that, but once I got to know him a little bit, it was a lot cooler. Yeah, and he was a very sensitive guy, and to walk into a room with a bunch of musicians he didn't know was uncomfortable for him, I imagine, and he was standoffish, and he wanted to know that, number one, you were sort of a reasonable person and that you could play. And once that was established, it was a lot better. And I'm forever grateful to Buddy, because he gave me the opportunity to play every night, to travel the world, to learn how to write and arrange. I did all my first writing and arranging for that band, which was an amazing opportunity.
So most of your playing with the band was on the road?
Yep. Although we did do week-long stints at Buddy's place in New York, which was wonderful, because we backed up people like Mel Torme and Joe Williams, Lou Rawls, and there was always two bands playing. There were always two bands playing on a given night. So, got to play opposite Stanley Tarantine, Lena Horne, Carmen McRae. It was just a really amazing introduction into the world of showbiz and jazz and music and art and all of it.
Were you also on the road with Tito Puente?
I did very little traveling with Tito.
So this was your first time on the road then?
Yeah. Well, actually, my first time was in 74. I played in a band with Ymir Deodato, who had a big record at the time. And I went to Japan with him and Canada. But yeah, my first, extended travel certainly was with the Buddy Rich Band. Traveling
on the road, what was it like in those days?
Well, we traveled by bus, Greyhound bus. There was a lot of free time. I did a lot of reading, a lot of writing, listening to music, collaborating with musicians in the band. I learned a lot because I was one of the younger guys in the band. Several of these people took me under their wing. I learned a lot about the various cultures of the places we went to. It was all really fascinating to me. And I figured I should take advantage of this as best I can. I remember when the first little drum machine came out, I bought a little $40 battery-operated drum machine at Manny's in New York. And I took that on the bus, and I would spend hours programming drum beats. I was just so fascinated by it, because I always wanted to be a drummer too. And in fact, when I would write for Buddy's band, Buddy didn't read music. On the first run-through, I would play the drums, and Buddy would listen. And I think he gave me a bunch of grief about it. He would say, "Okay, are you through?" And I say, "Yeah." He'd go, "Good. Now I'm going to play it my way, my band. Get your own band." But sort of half in jest. He was just playing with me. But I really think he appreciated the fact that here was an opportunity for him to hear the piece with somebody playing the drums, as lame as it probably was, to give him some idea of how the music went. And he had this uncanny ability to just remember detail in music. He would listen to something once and then he knew it. He'd say, "Okay, great, we're going to play that tonight." And then he knew it forever.
You still have a drum set in your studio?
I do. I've had a drum set for 40 some odd years, and I still play. Yeah.
What came after Buddy Rich?
Let's see, I left Buddy in summer 77 and just tried to stay in New York, started doing some studio work, Broadway shows, playing with other jazz groups around New York. 78, I joined the Thad Jones Mel Lewis Big Band, did that for a little while, and then Thad moved to Europe. I stayed with Mel for a little while, till about 1980, something like that. Played with a variety of musicians, played with Eddie Palmieri, Joe Chambers, Ray Mantilla. Then in 81, I met Jaco Pastorius and joined his word of mouth band and did that for 2 years, 81, 82. Around that same time, I started a big band in New York. There was a club called 7th Avenue South. And I put a band together just on a whim, basically, to play there. I called Dave Sanborn and Mike and Randy Brecker and Peter Erskine, Will Lee, Don Grolnick, Lou Soloff, Dave Bargeron, Dave Taylor, Barry Rogers. It was an all-star band, and everyone took notice. And that sort of jump-started this big band career, which honestly I had no intention of doing. I wanted to play in a small group.
Were you writing the charts at that time?
I had written for Buddy's band and for Thad and Mel a little bit. And when this opportunity came along to play in this club, I wrote a couple of charts. And we played there, and it was sold out. And so we played there some more. And then this fellow, Tom Jung, wandered into the club one night. He was starting a compact disc company. This was in the early days of CDs. And he asked me if I wanted to work with him. And so we struck up a relationship, and that lasted 20 some odd years, which was amazing. I did 12 big band CDs for DMP. And that, of course, that's one of the crucial components of developing a sound and style, having a recording situation where you can conceive music with a band of your choosing and record it and, kind of have some level of progression from record to record. And it was amazing opportunity.
You've been with the Yellowjackets now for more than 20 years.
27 years.
It's obviously a very important part of your musical life.
It is.
Tell us about what the group means to you and how it fits into what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, so that's an interesting story. 1988, I was working with Michael Franks, and we went to Aruba, and we played a jazz festival down there. And the Yellowjackets were supposed to perform after us, and their gear never showed up. So they were hanging around, and Steve Kahn, the guitarist, was also with Michael, and he was friendly with Jimmy Haslip in the Yellowjackets. So after our set, we all wound up congregating and hanging out. And so I got to know those guys a little bit. And then 1989, I was at your old stomping ground, Northern Colorado, University of Northern Colorado in Greeley, and was the guest artist with their big band on their festival. And the Yellowjackets played, I think, before us on the same day. So again, we sort of crossed paths, and I got to hang with them a little bit. Then summer of 1990, I got a call from Jimmy Haslip. Our saxophone player's leaving. Might you be interested in doing a recording with us and seeing if there's something there? So I thought, that sounds intriguing. I honestly didn't know all that much about the Yellowjackets. I knew they were a great band, great musicians. Hadn't followed their music particularly. And I then went and started to listen to some of their recordings, plus the demo that Russ Ferrante sent me that was to become the first CD I did with them called Greenhouse. And it was like, whoa, this is some pretty heavy music here, beautiful compositions and nice playing. And I loved this sort of blurred direction. It wasn't totally straight ahead jazz. It was this confluence of all sorts of different concepts and sounds and flavors, and it just seemed really intriguing. So
Greenhouse is still one of my favorites.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting record. It's definitely a stew with very unusual ingredients. And anyway, came out and did that project with them, and it was amazing. And I thought, wow, this is something. I'm really, really happy to have had this opportunity. And we went a few months later to Asia for a month and did some playing. And at that point, I was basically just trying to learn the secret code in the Yellowjackets, because they had a very particular way of playing. And I wanted to learn more about it and see how I could somehow integrate into that. And over time, a couple of years went by, and I think it was starting to feel comfortable, like I felt a part of the band at that point, and signed on as a member. And now this is an unusual group in that there's no leader. So it's a partnership, and has been so since the beginning. And I think it's sustained itself for this long because everyone really respects and worships this partnership arrangement where, the main focus is the group. Not any one individual. And so you forfeit some level of individuality, but not really. It's more about being a good listener and being empathetic to others, and, sacrificing, in some instances where you may have a strong opinion about something that doesn't coincide with the group conscience, And it was very interesting to me, and still is. It's a great exercise in empathy and being considerate and being collaborative, And I think that really carries over into the music. Music is extremely collaborative in that band. It's an ensemble. We're really going for that. As a horn player, I think less of myself as soloist on top of rhythm section. It's more like I'm folded into that rhythm section. There's this give and take that goes on where it's equally critical for me to pay attention to what the rhythm section is doing as they pay attention to what I do, so that we can find this common ground.
And the musical style of the group has evolved.
It has, very much so. I mean, the style, first of all, is very broad and open, and anybody can sway the direction of that style by bringing in a certain composition or just discussing a concept. For example, Will Kennedy in the early 90s was getting together with an African drummer, and he brought to the table some really interesting approaches to rhythm and these drum patterns that ultimately became compositions. And I think we've all done that to some extent. You know, I've certainly been influenced by classical music, by music from Brazil, by folk music. You know, it's kind of wide open that way.
Moving on, as chair of jazz studies at USC, you work with some very talented young students, and also with some amazingly talented faculty. Mm-hmm. Tell us about this.
Well, let's see. I was living in New York. I've lived in New York my whole life. 2006 or 7, I don't remember exactly which year, I was approached by the University of Southern California, Los Angeles, to consider taking this endowed chair position that Shelley Berg had previously inhabited. Shelley now is the dean of the Frost School of Music in University of Miami. And it sounded somewhat interesting, but it also sounded daunting. I mean, the thought of moving across the country was not so very appealing to me. I mean, I was well set up in New York. I was on the faculty of Manhattan School of Music. I was going to Europe once a month as a guest soloist, conductor, arranger, playing with the Yellowjackets. I mean, I was busy in New York, and I wasn't quite sure how that would all translate to living on the West Coast. I mean, I had nothing against living on the West Coast per se. I think earlier in my career, I did, in that I felt it was critical for me to be around New York. I mean, but that was a time when there was a flourishing studio scene. I was busy in the studios. You know, I was on the scene in New York. I mean, as time progressed, I started a family. I was touring with the Yellowjackets. When I'd come off the road, it was much more difficult to hang out in New York and stay plugged into that scene. So I started to kind of remove myself from the New York scene little by little, out of consideration for my family, among other things. And so we thought long and hard about this move to Los Angeles, and thought, okay, well, let's give it a try, right? So we figured we'd come out for a year and try it out. So we did, and I had never really been full-time at a university before this, so it was pretty overwhelming. And being in a new school and developing curricula and all that came with this move really was a lot. And I wasn't really sure how it was going. I think there was a 2-year transitional period where not only I wasn't sure, I don't know that the school was so sure either, but I give them a lot of credit. They have put together a faculty of, you know, working full-time musicians that also take teaching very seriously. And I think that's a compelling environment for an aspiring student of jazz in particular, because, you know, you have, number one, all this knowledge of a working faculty, and number two, you have the conduit into the working jazz world through all these teachers, and inevitably the teachers at USC wind up hiring the better students to play with them. Add to that the fact that this is Los Angeles, which is by some ways of thinking, the entertainment capital of the world. There's a lot of activity there. There's a good deal of jazz activity. The studios are all humming and people are recording music for one thing and another. There's the whole film industry. And there's a lot of compelling reasons why one might want to train in LA nowadays. So anyway, it took a couple of years to really settle in to the teaching and to kind of learn the lingo, so to speak. I mean, you know, I'm kind of a self-taught musician in many ways, but it was very interesting to me to become more articulate in what I do and, you know, how I sort of organize my musical thoughts. And I have to say I've learned as much or more than my students in the 10 years I've been at USC.
Have you been able to shape the curriculum?
I have, yeah. I teach a class called Elements, which initially was conceived by Shelley Berg, but it's sort of an introduction. At least the Elements 1 class I teach is an introduction to the world of music, you know, with jazz as a major focus. So we talk about repertoire, vocabulary, you know, the components of a small jazz group, you know. Everybody sits at a drum set, everybody plays piano, everybody picks up a bass, you know, everybody writes and arranges. It's a great opportunity to get with freshmen and say, look, I'm laying out all these tools here, you know. You may want to emphasize some more than others, but you want to have a basic understanding of all this stuff before you kind of venture into more of a specialty. And I think that's been very helpful and inspiring to the students. I bring my horn in to the class and I play with them, and I try to show them, you know, in my actions what I'm talking about. You know, it's not just throwing data at them. I'm saying, here, this is how you do it, and demonstrating. And I also bring in a lot of outside people to work with these kids.
What advice do you have for an aspiring jazz musician? And follow up, how can you actually make a living as a jazz musician?
Well, I make a living as a jazz musician, but I have to say, I've done other kinds of music in the process of building a jazz career. I did everything and anything initially. I mean, I was a woodwind doubler. I played flute, clarinet, and saxophone. I studied classical music. I learned how to play R&B saxophone. I learned a variety of styles of jazz. I learned how to write and arrange. You know, I had experience recording myself and others. So, you know, being well-rounded will afford you the opportunity to maybe not do your ideal kind of work initially, but to thrive and survive. And I found playing any kind of music helped me to grow as a musician and help my jazz playing ultimately. So diversity is a key component of being a successful musician. Working really hard is the other component. You know, when I was in college, I did not hang out. I went to the practice room. I was working very hard in a focused way on music. And when I got out of college, I did the same thing. I mean, I do the same thing today. I work really hard, you know.
Would you tell some of your students to play rock and roll or to play rhythm and blues?
Sure.
Or
Absolutely. In fact, we talk about that in the Elements class, you know, generally. You know, there's some of the R&B / swing players like Willis, Gatortail, Jackson, you know, was sort of on the fence between rock and roll and R&B and jazz, you know. I mean, King Curtis, gosh, Fathead Newman. I mean, you know, there's a lot of commonality in all that music. So, you know, I mean, if you want to be a good jazz player, of course you want to know a little bit about what, you know, the various side ventures of the R&B guys and the swing guys, the Texas tenors. You know, there's that whole area of sort of swing country music that kind of treads over into the world of jazz a little bit. So it's all part of the big picture, you know. I think the more you know about the big picture, the more informed your playing is in whichever specialty you reside in.
Including classical.
Absolutely. Totally. Yeah. I mean, any of the jazz greats will tell you that there was some sort of influence from classical composition, classical music in some way, shape, or form.
What's in the future for Bob Mintzer?
Oh, well, I don't know, quite honestly. I'm going to Germany on Saturday to work with the WDR Big Band. We're doing a project with a great singer named Laurie Perry from the Perry Sisters, somebody the Yellowjackets have worked with in the past. This is something I always wanted to do. So now that I'm conductor over there, I'm having the ability to realize some of these projects I always wanted to get involved with.
Tell us about the WDR band.
Well, it's the WDR Big Band is one of the best jazz big band organizations in the world, and they're a full-time band, and I am what's called the chief conductor. I'm not there all the time. I'm there part of the time. Vince Mendoza, a very fine arranger and conductor, is called composer in residence, and he's there a fair amount of time. He's doing projects with them as well. Then there's a stable of very fine composers, arrangers, conductors that also work with that band. Some who live in Europe, some who live elsewhere. So it's a wonderful vehicle for writing, for conceiving interesting projects, and I'm very happy to be doing that. So my three major activities at this point are that, the WDR Big Band, teaching at USC, and playing with the Yellowjackets. So that's kind of three jobs, that function simultaneously.
Three full-time jobs, almost.
Three full-time, it's a mouthful. It really is, but it's so inspiring, and it's so invigorating to be active in this way as a player, as an arranger, as a composer, as a producer, if you will. And it really inspires me to keep learning and searching and checking out new things, and I'm very happy.
Would you comment on the Eastman 52nd Street saxophone?
Sure. Should I tell the story? I can tell the story quickly. I met you, Roger, I think through James Rotter, right, at USC, who was the saxophone instructor in the classical department at the time. And I think I stood you up initially. If I remember correctly, I was going to come try the horns, and I got busy. I couldn't do it. Anyway, I thought, let me call back and just apologize, if nothing else, for not showing up. So we arranged for a subsequent meeting, and I think you and Ralph Torres from Eastman came over and brought a few horns, and I played the 52nd Street tenor, and it was like, wow. It was kind of an instantaneous, interesting sensation. It was quite different from the Mark VI I had been playing forever, but I thought, this is pretty interesting. I could play this, I think, but it would take some getting used to. So we sort of had this informal arrangement that, and honestly, what I always thought was, if I were to start with a new instrument, a new horn, that wasn't an old vintage horn from the 50s, my choice would be the Eastman 52nd Street saxophone. It had a lot of very interesting qualities, and it felt good to play. So if you fast forward a few years, I had a gig over in Japan, and I took that horn just to kind of stir the pot. And there were some other outside issues, but I played the horn for 10 days and fell in love with the instrument. And I felt that, number one, I could hear myself better. Number two, it just, the notes locked in a certain way, particularly like when I was playing in unison with a synthesizer or piano. And I liked something a lot about the sound. It was somewhat reminiscent of the old Kahn 10Ms, but with the mechanisms of a more modern instrument, as in Selmer Mark VI. And that was 4 or 5 years ago, and I've not touched my Selmer since. I've been, really getting inside this horn, and it just, as time goes by, it just feels more and more comfortable, and I feel like I can really express myself on the horn. It has a wide variety of color possibilities. It barks. I can play loud. I can play soft. I can play controlled, bright, dark. I pretty much can do whatever I need to do on it.
Bob, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. I have to say, I think the Eastman company, aside from making a great saxophone, which, directly affects me, is a very smart, well-run, decent company. I'm very fond of all the people that work here, yourself included, Roger, and I appreciate the fact that you really work with the people that play your instruments, and hence you have quality instruments that are sold at an affordable price. They're well thought out, well conceived, well made, and that's what we all want. We want to be able to play an instrument that allows us to not think about the instrument, to really kind of get to the music. And, when an instrument is working well and feels comfortable, that's the goal. That's what we all aspire to achieve. And I think Eastman has been able to do that in a big way. And I applaud you for it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger.